Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the Engineer's going to be there. Meat Eater Live, headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay, every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Art Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your guide to the whitetail woods. Presented by First Light, creating proven, versatile hunting apparel for the stand, saddle, or blind. First Light, go farther, stay longer. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this week on the show, I'm joined by wildlife biologist and author Douglas Chadwick to explore the current state of wildlife across the world today and a new way of thinking that might just save those creatures and us. All right, welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light. It's me, Mark Kenyon. I am back in the saddle here. The Taylor Swift concerts, the yo-yo competitions, the rock collecting exploits with Spencer, whatever it is, those crazy things that Tony's been filling your head with, they're all done. I'm out here, back in the saddle, back here on the podcast. Hope you enjoyed Tony's guest hosting over the last month, exploring all sorts of different off-season projects that I think will help all of us as we lead into this next season. But here I am, and we are kicking off a new series. This is a series we've done for the past couple of years. It's one of my favorites that we do every year, and that's Conservation Month. We are going to take a step back from deep hunting conversations and tactical hunting conversations, and instead have some conversation around the thing, the resource, the creatures that allow us to enjoy this hunting lifestyle. There wouldn't be any deer to chase. There wouldn't be any wild places to chase them on. There wouldn't be any beautiful mountain vistas, crystal clear streams, any of these things that we enjoy so much as hunters and anglers if there weren't people thinking about and working for the conservation of wild animals and places. And that's what this month is all about, is stepping into that world and exploring, what kind of impact we might be able to have there. What's going on in the wilder world? What should we be excited about? What should we be concerned about? And what's our role to play? And, I got to tell you, just on a personal note, that this kind of stuff can be fun. This kind of work, these kinds of conversations, it does not have to be dreary. It does not have to be a drag. This kind of stuff is fun, and I have a personal, real-world example of this just from last week because, as some of you might know, given my little updates here, the Working for Wildlife Tour kicked off at the end of March. We had our first event outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and me and dozens and dozens and dozens of many of you and others came out to a wildlife management area, like I mentioned, in Massachusetts. We got together on a Sunday, and we picked up a whole load of trash, like literally an entire dump truck load. More than 1,000 pounds of trash were picked up by folks out there that day. We put up, I think, 6 different wood duck boxes. We pulled out of there all sorts of shotgun shells, tires, beer cans, you name it. I mean, there's a whole lot of crap that was out there, fouling up this beautiful piece of public land that is no longer there. It was good work. It was just rewarding to do something like that and to immediately see, in some small way, things get a little bit better by way of our handiwork and our time. But what stood out the most, maybe, and I guess I should have known this coming in, but what I was really reminded of coming out of it was just how much fun it is to do that kind of stuff, to get out there with other people that care about wildlife, that like to hunt or like to fish, and who also like to keep these things around, who also want to give back. Just being around other people that cared about those same things and all kind of joining in to do something good and worthwhile was really fun and re-energizing and uplifting. So I came out of that just, more charged up than ever to just do more of those kinds of things, to step away from the words of things, worrying about what you read on the news, or, even being on a podcast like this, talking about ideas of what to do, and actually getting into the world of action, actually doing something that is good. That felt great. And that's got me more excited than ever to do this series this month, exploring different ways we can all take action to make sure that, our kids and grandkids do still have public land to explore, do have wild, quiet, clean places to explore, that do have great hunting opportunities or wildlife viewing opportunities or fishing opportunities, that there's still some wild creatures running around out there that we all enjoy, and making sure things are better for the future. That's the kind of stuff that I'm excited about talking about this week. And we're going to kind of go all over the place with this series. We're going to have, some episodes that are very high level, looking at the worldwide state of nature, what's going on. That's going to be today, really. We're going to look at different ideas about how to think about ourselves in relationship to nature, but we're also going to zoom really tightly into things like, we're going to have some episodes very specifically focused on white-tailed deer, and others that are focused on all sorts of things. We're going to have some episodes that go, right into the nitty-gritty, for example, of one specific piece of conservation legislation that will have huge impacts on white-tailed deer and private land conservation and hunter access and habitat protection, all kinds of stuff like that. We've got a conversation next week on that topic. We're going to reach out to a couple folks and get into all sorts of different ideas for, how we and as hunters and anglers can be more effective advocates for these things that we care about. So we're going to be all over the place. And today, as I mentioned, we're starting out at this high level 30,000 foot overview of nature and wildlife and where things stand today. And not just when it comes to deer or wild game here in America, but across the world. And our guest today is going to help us explore that and also consider, how we might be thinking about our relationship or obligation to these wild things. So our guest today, as I mentioned at the top, is Doug Chadwick. He is a wildlife biologist. He's a widely published writer, frequently seen in the pages of magazines like the National Geographic, and the author of, I believe, more than 14 books, including The Wolverine Way, Tracking Gobi Grizzlies, and most recently, 4/5 a Grizzly, a new perspective on nature that just might save us all. And Doug has lived an incredible life, it seems. He has seen some amazing things. He's traveled the wild world, gotten up close and personal with grizzlies, whales, mountain goats, and just so many other fascinating wild creatures. And over the course of those years and expeditions, Doug has seen a diminishing world. He has had this firsthand experience seeing wild places wink out and wild creatures pushed to the brink. And all of this has seemed to have led Doug to a realization that maybe it's time we rethink our place alongside these animals, or at least rethink how we think about our place with these animals. Doug, it seems, began to think that we might have more in common with these animals than we once thought. And if that's true, if we do have more in common with these animals, what does that mean for how we live with or conserve wild places and animals? These are the thoughts and ideas that eventually led to this recent book by Doug, 4/5 of Grizzly, which within its pages explores the real and widespread threats currently facing wildlife all across the world today, what we might be able to do to address it, and some great examples of successes that we are seeing today in that pursuit. That's what made this book so interesting to me, and that is why I was so excited that Doug was willing to come on here and talk to us about a new way of seeing ourselves as a part of nature. Not apart from nature, but a part of nature. This fundamental shift in how we think about ourselves that I think can help us become better hunters. I think it can help us become happier humans. And I definitely think it can help us become more effective stewards of these wild things. And so if we can process some of this and think about this and maybe reconsider where we stand in relation to the deer that we hunt, the turkeys we chase, the fish we catch, the bears we watch when we drive through Yellowstone, whatever it might be, maybe all of that can help us, take these next couple months worth of conversations and put it into action, leading to better things for us in our outdoor pursuits, leading to better opportunities for our kids, and so much more. So that is the game plan today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get to my chat now with Douglas Chadwick. All right, now with me on the line, I'm really excited to have Mr. Douglas Chadwick. Doug, thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm happy to be here, of course, and you're in Bozeman, aren't you?
So the company Meat Eater is based in Bozeman, but I actually split my time between Michigan and Idaho. So I'm kind of all over the place.
Well, I was gonna try to console you because I think they got almost 2 feet of fresh snow in Bozeman yesterday.
Yes.
Spring is going rapidly backwards in some parts of the Rockies. It's looking good today on the west side.
Yeah, a lot of my friends in Bozeman have been sharing pictures of that dreaded 2-foot snowfall when they're hoping to see some kind of green growth again. I think at my place in Idaho, there's something like 4 feet still. So I'm going to be digging my way into the driveway here in a few weeks when I get out there.
Okay.
But I'm sure you've had a lot of that snowfall up in your neck of the woods too, huh?
We have. It's been good. I do a lot of cross-country skiing and just animal tracking, getting out. And, of course, all of us in Montana, well, in a lot of the country, we're praying for more moisture and save us from once again having the wildfire season start a month early.
Mm-hmm.
With the bigger picture of things here is there's a lot of transition going on. I'm looking at the Continental Divide from my home in Whitefish and have hiked that all my life. And I'm watching glaciers literally shrink in front of my eyes and trees marching up the slopes into the tundra. And, it's a real phenomenon that affects, I used to study mountain goats and in the park as well as in the Swan Range of Montana. And these high altitude critters have got a whole new, set of rules to survive by. So anyway, lots of snow is good. Let the glaciers grow bigger.
Yes. Yeah. We need the snow, the moisture, the cold. It's going to be good for some critters out there. It'll be good for the fish in the rivers. It'll be good for,
exactly,
like you said, hopefully not as bad of a wildfire season. So, yeah, I think I'm sure all my buddies in Bozeman can handle a little extra snow in their hopes for spring because of the greater good.
Yep.
So you mentioned the work you used to do with mountain goats, and I've become relatively steeped in your history, preparing for this and reading your works over the years. You've lived, and I guess I'm speaking for you, so correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but it seems like you've lived a fascinating life, that you've been able to go to some wild places. You've got to study such charismatic animals. You've You've been able to travel the world and just see and experience unbelievable things. And I'm sure it's obvious to me about, why you would want to do these things and why this, I'm sure, is so fulfilling for you. But what my question is, to a degree, is when did those travels and your work as a biologist and a writer, when did all of that shift for you from just adventure seeking or curiosity satiating? When did it shift from that to advocacy? When did you shift from being a consumer of these wild experiences to then wanting to protect them or advocate for them? When did that happen for you? How did that happen for you?
Well, boy, it's a long and complex question. I'll try to keep it short.
Okay.
It actually started pretty early, Mark, because I did my graduate work in wildlife biology studying mountain goats, and I studied them in an area that was back in the day. I'm getting kind of antique, and this was back in the 70s when mountain goats were being hunted unlimited. They didn't know anything about them and didn't recognize them as a whole different kind of critter than, say, deer and elk. Their closest relative in North America is the muskox, and their other relatives are all found on the east coast of Asia. And they have a whole different social system and slow reproduction and all kinds of things. So anyway, I was up studying mountain goats, and I was watching new roads go into the backcountry, and grizzly bears were essentially being hunted unlimited in those days too. And there were very few regulations on logging and road building. So I kind of got activated early on because I was watching goats disappear. And that was happening throughout a large chunk of the goat range. And I was also watching grizzly bears disappear. They were listed as threatened while I was still on the job of being a goat boy. And so it struck me, well, wait, these are public resources, and they're both tremendously inspiring in their own way. I mean, we all know about grizzlies and the emotions they evoke, but mountain goats are kind of sentinels of the high country and live in one of the highest, steepest niches ever invented for a warm-blooded mammal. And anyway, I just thought, this is silly to be having these vanish at this rate. What can I do? And so I did start writing for popular magazines, looking into how to affect public policy. I don't claim to be any good at that. I just got activated. So that took place early, and then I did get lucky and latch on to kind of a career with National Geographic as an independent writer, but I worked for them for many, many stories and books, and that's got me sent out around the world. And it turned out that everywhere I went, the U.S. started looking better and better, and I'm watching animals disappear around the globe, and I'm talking about up to and including the giants. I work with elephants. I work with great whales, or I should say I volunteered as a researcher when I could, but a lot of time I was just tagging along after the experts in the area where I was, trying to figure out what would work and what wouldn't for conservation. So a lot of good, I'd say, blind luck plus passion to be in wild places among inspiring wildlife.
Yeah. Going to all those places, Doug, and being with so many people working towards either researching these wild animals or actually working to protect them in one way or another. You've seen all these things firsthand. You've been with people working on these problems and issues. Do you feel having that set of experiences and being exposed to all of that all over the world, both here at home and elsewhere, has that made you more worried about the situation at hand and disheartened, or has that given you hope and confidence because you see the good things being done? Where have you landed after being exposed to the reality on the ground in so many places?
Okay, can I tell one quick story?
Yeah, please do.
I was working with people who were studying the vocabulary, basically the songs, the vocal messages of humpback whales, and we were allowed to swim with them by special permission because they're a protected species. But you know how we all go out to have wildlife adventures, and the bigger the better, the critter. Mm-hmm. And I remember a whale that came over to me, and it was, really steaming along, full speed, headed straight for me. This is a humpback, and then it put out these big fins it has called pectoral fins, and just acts as instant brakes. And it stopped about 2 feet from my nose.
Wow.
And, I felt like, now this critter has a brain about 3 times my size, and it lives as long or longer than humans, and it sings the longest song in the world, and it came over to see me. I felt like a little bug that someone bent down to look at, and you can just imagine the presence of a 35-foot, 40-foot long animal being nose to nose with it underwater. And I remember coming back up onto the boat, and my first thought was, "Oh, damn! Now what? Not going to ever get any better than this."
Yeah.
As far as venturing, but I guess I'm trying to lead into, say, working with elephants. My first introduction to them was during the late 1970s, early 80s, and they were all being slaughtered, just at a mass level for their ivory, which at the time was worth more than if their tusks had been made of solid silver. So you can't stop a market like that in countries with very little law enforcement and corrupt governments. And I was just walking from dead elephant to dead elephant. So I guess I'm working my way towards saying that the activism part, the passion to say, God, Chadwick, get smarter, do something, figure out something to, help here. And if you're talking about elephants, you're talking about whole landscapes it takes to support them, and also the welfare of the people that live there, and the economics of tourism and all kinds of things that some countries rely on. So if I'm looking at, let's say, tropical forests, and I'm watching them, I've been in the Amazon and the Congo and watched the forest, being transformed into palm oil plantations and that sort of thing. I don't go there looking for problems. I don't go there all fired up and I'm going to go out and be a environmental activist frame of mind. I just go to learn about the animals, and what I see does keep me motivated to figure this out. What groups? Okay, so that's the bad part. I mean, there are 8 billion people in the world. It's not real apparent when you live in the mountains of Montana, but that's almost 3 times as many as were around on this planet when I was learning how to do biology and conservation.
Wow.
In school, right? It's a whole new ball game. And I don't think most people are up to speed on it unless they travel a lot in parts of Asia and Africa where the animals are simply running out of room, especially big animals. And I guess I could put it this way. If you take the living weight of all the land-dwelling mammals on the planet, about 23% of that is humans. All but a little slice of the remaining percentage is our livestock. It's like 76% or 73%, somewhere in there. And there's a little little slice of the pie left that is 4%, and that's all the wild animals that remain on Earth today. Okay. All the wild, I'm sorry, well, I'm talking about mammals, but what, I got to get my terms right, but that's it. And so, people try to compromise, and the compromise has long since been made in my experience. And so even as I get more motivated to try to do something, and I have been near to despair, outright despair in some places, just people everywhere doing everything and the animals losing. But the other motivation is to go out and find projects and programs that are working. And I'm especially intrigued by ones that, again, I'm a biologist. I love working with animals. I didn't plan to work with people, but now it's really key to go out and find communities that are working together to keep the health of the land and the wildlife communities that they all share. And that means protecting their water and the quality of their land and for grazing or whatever it is. What's working? That's what people want to know. Environmentalists are pretty good at alarming people and coming up with some pretty hard, you go to a party and pigeonhole people and say, here's another terrible thing you might not know about.
Sounds like fun.
Well, here's another awful statistic, but I want to be able to say, look, here is a program where the people are doing better. They're getting, more stable environment for their other activities. They're getting water that's healthier for their children to drink. Disease is going down. They've got more money from some tourism for health of children and women and the community as a whole. And they're doing this for their own reasons, not because people are coming from the outside from some rich country and saying, we're here to help, right? So I'm actually on a foundation. It's an international foundation that supports community-based conservation all around the world. I was just reviewing plans in Laos, in Argentina. You get the idea. And these are programs that are working. And so you combine more scientific information about animals, and boy, has that changed in that period I mentioned since I was in school. We know tons more about their behavior, their genetics, and their physiological needs. And we also know a whole lot more about the need to work with the people that live on the land and get away from that old idea. This is more than a century old now of we protect animals by declaring an exclusive reserve and fencing everybody out and limiting access. And then what are the people who have relied on that part of Asia or that part of Africa or that part of the U.S. for that matter? What are they supposed to do? So communities working together, that's a big part of the agenda for me now, is to explain that to people. It's working on a larger and more connected scale than we're used to working on with the old model of conservation. But I think I could point to several projects that do work like that, and I did put some in a recent book. I'll leave it at that. That's a pretty long answer already.
Well, no, you touched on some great things there, and I think one of the things that you do really well in that book you just mentioned is you help reframe how we look at these other species, these other parts of the natural world, and you titled the book around this idea. You led the book with this idea, and I think I get why you see it as being foundational to helping us think about how we, live alongside of these other animals. And this idea being that the old narrative of us being apart from nature, or that nature and us are two separate things, you seem to want to turn that on its head and say, no, not so much. We're all in this together. We are actually 4/5 a grizzly. Can you give us a quick cliff notes into what you mean by that, and why you think that kind of reshifting our perspective on our relationship with the natural world matters so much?
Sure. Well, I was raised in a pretty normal childhood, I guess, and I think we all kind of come away into our older years, or the years when we start questioning things. We don't really question the idea that we are kind of a supreme species, and we're either independent of nature or somehow liberated from it, separate from it in quality. We have the biggest brain per body weight, and a lot of rationales for doing what we've always done with resources, which is claim as much as we want, wherever we want, for as long as we want. And that paid off pretty well, right? Like I said, there are 8 billion of us now. The only other species that have a growth curve like the human population are bacteria. But again, now we're in a situation no other mammal has been in. And, we're changing the atmosphere, the water, the land structure, the patterns of habitat, everything. And so, I think a new view of conservation is in order, and that's going to start with, I don't think we're going to save nature as long as we don't see clearly our relationship with nature. And the reason we're at least 4/5 a grizzly is that there are about 6,400 species of mammals on planet Earth. And, never mind that there are 400,000 species of beetles identified. And there are probably 1 million out there, but we focus on the big charismatic critters. It's natural. And we share 80 to 90% of our genes with every mammal out there. And it goes up to 98% with chimpanzees, and the high 90s with other great apes. So, we are built from the same genes, and what we're discovering is a lot about how much we share in terms of behavior, of emotions, of other qualities built by those genes. And one of the most common phrases I see as I look through research papers on animal behavior is the comment, a trait formerly thought to be exclusive to humans. Why was it formerly thought to be exclusive to humans? Because it sort of suited the story we tell ourselves. And the other thing about being part of nature is that, and this gets into the geeky part, but we have about 30 trillion human cells in our bodies, and we have more single-celled creatures living within and on us than that. And they are doing our digesting for us just like they would in the rumen of a white-tailed deer. Can't live without it. They produce fatty acids and vitamins we can't make ourselves. They keep us going. And they're fighting off other possible infections, other single-celled critters. And they're producing hormones that are very much like dopamine and serotonin and other things that influence our mood and our thoughts and our actions. So we're actually a compound creature. We resemble a lichen, which is, an algae plus a couple of different kinds of fungus plus a bunch of bacteria. We call it a plant. And I would challenge anyone listening to go find an animal larger than bacteria or a similar group called archaea that is actually an independent creature. There doesn't seem to be any such thing. So combinations, partnerships, collaborations, joint ventures, that's what we are. And, you can't be apart from nature no matter how badly you want it to be. So that doesn't oblige you to go out and start driving Subarus and holding up signs of protest. It just means we're not who we think we are. Nature doesn't work the way we like to think it works. And genetically, we've got kin all over the world. And the last thing I'll add is, look, we're also 50 to 60% genetically identical to fish, and we share 30 to 40% even with some insects, and 44% with a wine grape. Maybe a little more than that some nights,
Right. Depends on the company you're with.
Yeah. That's why I wrote 4/5 of Grizzly I've been working with single species that represented whole ecosystems like grizzly bears. If you're taking care of their needs for home range and habitat and quality of food, you're probably encompassing everything from trout to trumpeters, swans to lynx and wolverines and elk and deer. But, whales, I worked on grizzly bears in the Gobi Desert. Just any way I could come at it, but it was always single species. But if you're protecting them, you're protecting a lot of biological diversity. You're protecting a lot of nature of an ecosystem. And then I thought, well, I haven't written a book like that. I'm still focused on the individual species or special places that need more attention. As a writer, you're sort of an arm waver or a cheerleader for things people haven't been paying attention to, and you're trying to get their attention. But I thought, no, we need to rethink a lot of things, again, with the idea that what does saving nature mean? And first we have to, I think, have a long and useful discussion about what is nature and what's the nature in us and where do we stand in relationship to it.
Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the engineer's going to be there. Meat Eater Live, headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay, every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Art Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.
I heard you mention on another show at some point, you said that people might say, I'm not that into nature, but nature's into you. I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, I know a lot of those in your audience. we're all meat eaters. And, you know, I've never turned down a fresh venison in my life. But while we're still kind of touching on global situation, and I don't throw out statistics again to be an alarmist or for rhetoric or to sway someone's opinion. It's just the facts based on a tremendous number of studies. And that's that about 60% of all the herbivores, of the hoofed mammals mostly, greater than 200 pounds, are imperiled species these days. And about 60% of all carnivores, that's all non-human meat eaters, right? Greater than about 33 pounds are also on the rare, threatened, or endangered species list. So it's a different world out there than the bubble I live in Montana, where we've still got a pretty intact wildlife community that's in pretty good shape.
Yeah. So that ties in really well to a story I want to tell you, Doug.
Okay, go.
I posted a photo on my Instagram page a couple weeks ago of an excerpt of your book. On page 46, there's like an enlarged piece of text where you were talking about kind of this very issue of the biodiversity crisis. And the quote here that I took a photo of and that I shared was this: as the number of people was roughly doubling in the 42 years between 1970 and 2012, the total population count of the planet's wild animals fell by more than half.
Yeah.
So I posted that picture, and I didn't really add any context. I just said, "for your consideration," was my caption, and put it out there. And it generated all sorts of questions. There was outrage at like disbelief, like there's no way this could be possible. There's no way anyone could have that kind of data, or that there's no way anyone could actually measure this. There were some people just very despairing of that. There were some folks who had genuine questions about how do we know this? How do we come to these kinds of conclusions? What can we do about it? There were some folks who said, you know, there are folks who started to point fingers. It's because of this. It's because of this. It's because of this. It generated a really interesting beginning of a conversation that sent me then down a wormhole to try to answer, or at least provide a little more context. So I ended up recording and sharing a 15-minute video explaining. I dove deep into where that number came from. I did research on trying to understand the Living Planet report from the World Wildlife Fund, and I read up on how the Living Planet Index is compiled, and shared all that, and discussed some different things around what we're seeing as far as this larger wildlife, these larger wildlife trends. So it was a great kind of exercise for me to have to think about what these statistics, like these kind of negative, depressing, I guess, metrics in the world right now, what those things mean and how we can do something with that data. Because it's one thing to just say it, like you said, like you can say this depressing, sad number that does point to a fact and point to a reality, but how do we understand what that actually looks like? How do we get to these numbers, and what do we do about it? So this is a long-winded way, Doug, of asking you to tell me this. That quote that I just shared with you, this idea of this biodiversity crisis, this idea that folks are saying that we are moving towards a sixth mass extinction event. As someone who's been out there on the ground, talking to the folks, researching these things, studying these things, and you've seen so much of it of yourself, does this ring true, or is it hyperbolic and it's alarmist?
It's true. Again, if I'm in Missouri, or I'm in California, if I'm in Montana, especially if I'm in Montana or I'm Alaska, I'd read that statistic and I go, what in the world are they talking about? This is more rhetoric, propaganda from the greenies. But when I'm in Asia and walking through a jungle and there's a snare, every 100 feet, And the jungle is lush and intact, but it's empty of big critters. It's all too clear. And when I'm in situations where I'm carrying a gun in Africa because of the threat of poachers, because I'm with park rangers, and we're coming upon, freshly killed carcasses all over the place, it's very real. And I did read the same report you did carefully, and I would say it was the World Wildlife Fund planetary evaluation. I think the Zoological Society of London.
Yep.
And it isn't like they just went out and did their own surveys in a few places. They wrote to everybody around the world and got all the census data they could. It's always imperfect, but it's thousands of studies, and put it together. And actually, it came out a couple of years ago. I recently saw the figure raised from almost 50% to 60% plus. And some have. The hard part is who's out there counting every salamander and lizard and that sort of thing. But you can certainly take large sample areas and get those figures. And again, depending on where you are, it makes sense to you or it just sounds catastrophic. But worldwide, that's the situation. The human footprint now lies across 83% of the land surface of the Earth. Those, a lot of them throwing out gloomy stats here. The prediction is that the plastic in the seas, including all the decayed plastic that becomes microplastics that gets into every living thing, it will outweigh all the fish in the world's oceans by 2050. So it's really hard for a single person living, in a familiar home with comfortable routines and enjoys getting in the outdoors and looks around and says, I don't see anything much different from day to day. But where are you? I'm not sure we're even built to see, that far or on that scale. But whenever you put it together globally, with 8 billion plus people on the planet in need of resources and with a whole lot more technology to get those resources and change environments to do it, I'm sorry, it's what's happening. And that's why there was a recent meeting to try to get all nations to make a commitment to preserving a certain percentage of biodiversity that they have on their lands and in their waters. Much as was done with the international meeting to take on the climate crisis. So I know a lot of people, there's a feeling like you're almost inclined to reject all this because it's just too much. You're used to people overstating crises. Mm-hmm. And, there'll be warnings about some particular chemical and we're all going to die and get deformed. And then, 2 months later, they say, oh, no, we did some more experiments. Turns out it's not a big deal. So it's easy to put these things in that category, but the loss of our fellow creatures is enormous. It's unprecedented. It hasn't been seen since an asteroid whacked into the planet at the end of the age of dinosaurs. But it's slow-mo enough by our standards that we don't go running out into the streets. And I wish it weren't true.
Yeah. Yeah, it is hard to face that. It's hard to accept that, both because it seems beyond possible, and it's like you said, in many cases it's hard to see the actual shift happening right in front of your eyes, especially if we're somewhere like in America where we are relatively, at least compared to many other places in the world, we still have relatively wild places. We still have the full suite of wildlife in some parts of the country. We still have, well-regulated wildlife management principles in play to give us the resources and the opportunities we have to see wild critters out there, but that's not the case in a lot of places. But yeah. I think even in each of our own individual lives, on a really micro scale, we can see examples of this. I mean, I was just telling my son, I've got a 5-year-old son who is at this phase in his life where he is fascinated by any of Dad's stories. He just wants to hear stories about when I was on some hiking trip, or the day I caught my biggest walleye, or that time that Grandpa pretended to be a black bear and scared my dad, or the time I caught my first snap, like all those things. He just, whenever we're driving, he's like, "Hey, will you tell me a story, Dad? Will you tell me the story of that thing?" And the other day he was asking me to tell him stories about catching snapping turtles when I was a kid. And so I told him about, every day during summer break, I'd go out behind the house and there was this swamp and this pond right next door. And every day in the summer, me and my next door neighbor would go there and we'd catch frogs all day, and we would catch snapping turtles when they would actually overnight be crawling across the road to get to another pond. And we'd wake up in the morning and get out and see these turtles crossing the road, and we'd go pick them up and take them back or take them across. Yeah. And that was how we would catch these huge snapping turtles. They would always be crossing. And he said, "Dad, let's go there. Can you please take me to go see this swamp and this pond and the snapping turtles? Can we catch those snapping turtles?" And I had to say, "Buddy, it's gone. That pond, that woodlot, it's houses now." And I don't think there's anyone listening today who can't point to some example like that in their life, of some favorite fishing hole or a favorite woodlot or a field where they used to chase butterflies or hunt for rabbits or hike or bird watch or something.
Well, I live in Whitefish. It's growing rapidly. It's a ski town and close to Glacier Park, and a lot of tourism. And during COVID, it seemed like everybody east of the Mississippi decided to move here, as well as California. But yeah, I could tell you about, and my kids know about canoeing the river that runs through town and watching moose. And we still have deer in our yard. But a lot of yards that I've also seen them in around me are now homes. And the moose are gone, and the wild turkeys are not as frequent. And, there's just a lot of people coming in, and they don't have, they don't have bad intentions. They simply want to live in a nice place. They actually love the outdoors. That's one reason they come. But, they don't always come with a commitment to try to find some way to make room for these other creatures as well as for ourselves. It can be done. I mean, there are plans and there are models for limiting the pace of habitat change. I know you guys focus often on whitetails, right? And
yep.
You're lucky because you're working with a species that's doing very well.
Yeah.
And rapidly reproduces, and most of all, it seems well adapted to disturbed habitats. So originally that was wildfires and floods and other changes from natural forces, but they do equally well in suburban areas. I'm just telling your audience things they know very well, and so that's always heartening. I mean, when I'm out picking apples in my field, I've usually got white-tailed deer standing below the tree waiting for me because I'm kind of butterfingers, and I drop a few. And, I'll be up on a ladder, and I'll feel a ladder shake, and say, "Oh, it's a deer." So, waiting. So, it does give you a different view, but if you are looking at other creatures and you're looking at, there's been a catastrophic loss of insects in the order of, 2/3 to 3/4. And all you have to do is occasionally check the number of bugs on your windshield this summer. It's not like it used to be most places. Well, there goes pollination, there go the wildflowers that so much of our wildlife community eats. And who knows what else? But it just is well worth paying attention to all the little things that run the world. If you talk to an insect person or a worm person or, God help you, a microbe person, I mean, they say, look, mammals are a sideshow in terms of weight, in terms of numbers, and to begin with. They're kind of, I don't know, a little filling somewhere in the food web, but they don't, the energy and the nutrients and the things that cycle through an ecosystem to keep it healthy and to help all the animals, large and small, survive over time and the changes time brings. Most of them are invisible or require some serious looking.
Yeah, it's interesting, kind of speaking of some of those things, and pollinators are another great example of this. There's one set of, I guess, rationale for trying to protect wildlife and biodiversity is just the moral imperative of it, or just the fact that we as individuals find these animals fascinating and we want to see them around, or we feel some connection with them. So there's that side of things. But then there's also the practical side of things, the practical argument of the fact that, as you mentioned with pollinators, they provide ecosystem services is this term for what the natural wildlife and wild places provide services. They do things, they support things that are foundational to human business, economies, life. You said something in your book that I really liked. You proposed a new golden rule. You said, do unto ecosystems as you would have them do unto you. And right after saying that, you kind of, I guess the way you framed it, I guess what I'm trying to say is you framed that not as a high-minded moral rule, but more as a practical survival strategy. So do unto ecosystems as you would have them do unto you. And that is a golden rule because it is a necessary survival strategy. Can you expand on that, what that means and what you think about that?
I'll start with the full golden rule, with do unto ecosystems as you would have them do unto you. Nurture, sustain health, allow to flourish. So our health is long-term, is indistinguishable from the health of the land, air, and water we all depend on, right? And you mentioned some of the more obscure species, the ones we don't pay a lot of attention to, but they're absolutely vital. And I don't, it sounds like it's asking a lot of people to go out and get to know all these varied life forms. There are so many, it's too many. And unless you like to geek out on some of the things I do, I say I work with elephants and whales, also with ants and beetles, and even talk National Geographic into doing stories on them. And because in Australia, I've been in places where the ants control the whole forest canopy, and any tree kangaroos or koalas or whoever else wants to live there has to deal with it, part of their environment. But I guess the question I feel like we're coming to, Mark, is let's just go back in time. And I know hunters are proud of the fact that, or see themselves as the original conservationists. And granted, it came about in an era when the national philosophy seemed to be, if it moves, shoot it, and if it doesn't, cut it down. But they were the original conservationists and continued to be so for a while. And all credit goes to them and some other foresighted people that maybe looked at some of the non-hunted species, but it was huge. My question, I think, to you and some of the folks listening is, who are the leading conservationists today, or where do hunters reside on that list? Are they still leading? Are they still, vitally important to the conservation work that remains to be done? And what do we do with that?
Yeah. And I think the answer is, from my perspective, that there are a lot of hunters and anglers who do care deeply about these things and who are leading, but there's so much more that needs to be done. There's so much more, and I think that there's so much more potential good we could do if the hunters and anglers working on these kinds of things are not working on these kinds of things in isolation, but are working with them hand in hand with the non-hunters and anglers who care about these things and are leading and doing great work for conservation. So I one of my big hopes and dreams for the future is seeing these two communities working more and more together, because it's a big number of folks. It's a serious constituency of people and of voters. If you combine those two groups of people, if you combine animal lovers and outdoor recreators, skiers and hikers and bikers and all those folks with all of the tens of millions of hunters and anglers, all these people that love nature, all these people who appreciate wildlife and fish and open space. And yeah, we might engage with it in different ways. We might live in the city, or we might live in the mountains or on a farm. But I feel like there's so much we could do if we could get better at looking past those differences and instead kind of compound our powers together to tackle stuff like what we're talking about today.
Couldn't agree more. And I know here in Montana, the hunters and anglers are tremendous spokesmen for taking better care of the environment, for public land protection and access, and proper access. And I think it'd be wonderful, Mark, if you could follow up on that, because I think we spend way too much time discussing how people feel about hunting, or one way or the other. And look, we can't make everybody an ethical hunter overnight. We can't make every conservationist stop acting like holier than thou, or being annoying.
Yeah.
And I think it would be tremendous to bring the different forces who care about the different groups that care about the future of life on the planet, but of the wild world they go into and that they know a lot about.
Yeah.
And I have great respect for a lot of my friends who are both avid hunters and very keen naturalists.
Yeah.
And I think one comes with the other. You got to know what you're doing out there. But not in all situations, all types of hunts, but really the guys out roaming the woods tend to know it. And it means a lot when they speak up for protecting the whole community of wildlife. And, when I see a deer, a couple of things. I think every creature out there is the right answer to the question of how best to live in a certain way, a certain place, or it wouldn't be here. It wouldn't have survived over the millennia. But I don't know. This is a tough one, but I feel like we need to somehow look at the deer and see what shaped it. The vegetation it eats, the animals it competes with for that vegetation, the predators. Why does a deer have the senses it does? Why does it have the fleetness, the ability to, jump over an 8-foot fence with a practical standstill? Mm-hmm. That was the work of predators over thousands of years. And I do know some hunters who, pretty down on predators because they see them as competing for meat.
Yeah.
But others that, respect the greater community that made the deer, or that made the elk as social and communicative as they are. As living in groups, many eyes are better than one pair. And what made the moose so strong and able to punch through deep snow and fend off, the mid-sized carnivores? It was just all these different natural forces, and you don't get one without the other, is the way I look at it. And if you just focus on one single species, nature doesn't really work that way. It's a process that takes place over time that makes each animal what it is. And that naturally leads you from whatever animals your favorites are. Could be wild turkeys, could be deer, could be, I don't know, elk here in Montana, certainly. But who else is living there with them, and what are they doing? And are we taking care of them? And obviously works. They were all here when we invaded this continent. And wildlife management sometimes makes it sound like, boy, it's sure good that we got here just in time to save all these animals. Well, no, they were doing just great, and they were diverse, were abundant, and nature was at its healthiest and most fertile. So, how much of that has been lost is something we can all debate over, but it's been a lot. And when you asked me earlier about the startling decline in numbers worldwide of vertebrates or animals with backbones, 40% on up to some say 60% now. And you say we don't see it in the U.S., but you got to remember that's partly because we don't see bison in the millions anymore. We don't see grizzlies in the tens of thousands. We don't see mountain caribou they were in the forests of Wyoming, right? And old growth forests of Idaho, farther south. And anyway, so it's hard, to come up with these comparisons. What was the natural state? What's here now? How much has declined? But I think rather than get lost in that, I would just say, here's what we've got. We've done a decent job with the tools we had of conserving it. We can do much more, much better. I mean, I've been out, I was volunteering on a wolverine study just because I realized it's an animal I'd seen but didn't really know anything about. And then I realized nobody knows much about them, and they were getting overlooked and they were declining. We probably got 350 or fewer in the lower 48 states. And, I just, there's a lot of animals in situations like that, candidates for listing, for protection. If enough people are working together on management plans and ways to improve things for those critters, they don't have to get listed. Or if listed, they'd be off the list pretty darn quick if we made a few right moves. And that's all worth looking at. It's all worth considering. And every animal deserves, I think, the same amount of value. I'm not going to say that deer hunters are going to turn into, avid Wolverine fans. But Wolverines are, wow, what a critter. I followed them up to the tops of mountains that are 10,000 foot plus and right around here. And they're climbing ice and snow that no human climber could get up. They go 24 hours a day. I mean, they are just amazing. It's like they're fueled by nuclear energy or something. And they can stand up grizzly bears over a carcass. I mean, wow, that's attitude.
Yeah. So, it's funny. One thing we haven't really touched on, which probably a lot of folks are asking, is what's causing all this, other than the overarching umbrella of humans. There might be people saying, all right, I hear what you're saying. We are losing a lot of wildlife across the world. There's lots of threatened species. There's lots of trends going in the wrong direction. But what specifically is making this happen? And as I understand it, Doug, in my own reading and research and projects related to this, I've seen most of the causes lumped into 5 buckets. That being, the various forms of habitat destruction, the impacts of climate change, pollution in its many different forms, invasive species, and then, overkill or overharvest or poaching of fish and wildlife in different situations. I've seen those as the 5 main culprits of this overarching biodiversity crisis across the world. Would you say, does that sound right to you, Doug? And secondly, is there any one of those or several of those that from your work and experience seems to stand out above the rest?
Unfortunately, no, but there are some we can fix more easily. And the pollution that's just heedlessness. And it's causing as many, more people die from air pollution every year than from AIDS, malaria, and I forget what else, certainly COVID combined. It's huge. And if you go to Beijing or you spend time in Delhi or someplace, you're going to get sick if you breathe that air long enough. And millions of people are being affected. And that's just economics. And that change has to come from the people being affected. And I don't know, man. I rapidly get out of my element because I'm just an old goat boy, wildlife biologist, and all of a sudden the changes that need to occur are social and economic and involve, the resources we're taking from the land, and whether it's harvesting animals or legally, or in most of the world illegally, or simply because there's no law enforcement. That's one thing, but geez, taking on the economics of resource extraction that's above my pay grade.
Yeah.
I think it's got to be people, and unfortunately, they're not those in power, but the people being affected often. But they have somehow to get support from other places, but start making those changes themselves. Just as each of us, sometimes you feel silly recycling your pop cans or doing those little things, turning off the lights and all that. But of course, if millions were doing it, it would make a huge difference. I do it just because it makes me feel a little better.
Mm-hmm.
And trouble, but I think the next stage is people taking part in meetings, writing letters, all the usual things. But we talk about it, but not that many people do it. And again, if legislators are starting to hear from hunters about a proposed development of some kind, and it doesn't have to be we're going to go lie down in front of the bulldozer. It's just we looked over your plan and you could do a better job of making sure contamination is limited, or some site the facility somewhere else besides the side of that mountain where elk winter, or put that new subdivision somewhere else. People can we can make a big change down at City Hall. We can make a big change by going to the county commissioners, and make a change by going to the state legislature and hollering about things. And just saying, I'm not here to fight, really. I'm here to make a change that we can all live with. Let's start with that. And being a generation after us, I can continue doing that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It does. So I've got a question about maybe one specific example of something like this that hunters have started engaging in and maybe could do more, and that I think ties into a couple of these larger challenges to wildlife, being in the form of habitat fragmentation and destruction and the impacts of climate, let's say. There's something I'd love you to talk a little bit about, which is the island effect. And the importance of migration corridors. And this migration corridor push is picking up steam within the conservation community for many, many years. But now in the hunting community, there's been a lot of interesting studies over the last 5-10 years about pronghorn migrations, mule deer migrations, that are kind of opening the eyes for people and realizing how far these critters go. And so that's I think, opening a lot of hunters' eyes to the necessity for connective tissue between different wild places, because they're now seeing a species they pay attention to a lot needs these connections and corridors. But there's a much wider impact to having these kind of corridors available, because we're seeing, whether it be grizzly bears or pronghorn or any number of different species, they need to be able to move, not only because of natural migrations, but also because the temperatures and the climate zones they need to survive are shifting. And they're going to have to shift north or up to be able to continue to have that kind of thing. And this is becoming increasingly challenged because of this island effect. Can you tell folks about the island effect, how that impacts wildlife, and how we might be able to start dealing with that and creating better corridors and connections to solve for that?
Sure. And thanks for bringing that up, because that is key. And because we're on the solutions end of things right now. Mm-hmm. And the old model of conservation was kind of like the King's Hunting Reserve, or, earlier, where you set aside a chunk of land that's scenic, has recreational values, has wildlife values, and you limit access or put a fence around it, as they do in some of the African reserves, and say, hey, we've saved nature. Well, the 80% almost of the extinctions that have taken place since the year 1500 have been on oceanic islands. And it's because, of course, they're isolated. They're subject to whatever comes through, disease or invasive species, hurricanes, changing climate in that particular part. But they can't go anywhere, and they can't get replaced from neighboring populations. And the whole time, if they're not a very large population, they're going to be inbreeding. And the way genetics works is 9 times out of 10, that species goes extinct. And that's essentially a model that applies to the way we've done this on land, on different continents. We make isolated reserves here and there where it's possible, where there was still wild land and still a rich wildlife community, and declare it a reserve. And now the big push worldwide, because of all those factors I mentioned, and more studies over the past half century, all pointing this direction, is that you have to build in that flexibility for animals to adapt. And you brought up changing climate here on the continent. They have to move up, maybe north or south, maybe to a moister set of conditions, but they've got to be able to move and flow and swap genes and meet new girlfriends and party in different places. If I go out with a bear biologist, we slap a radio collar on yet another grizzly, it might be in Glacier Park, but the next week it's in Canada, it's in Alberta, then it's over in British Columbia, then it's down in the National Forest in western Montana, etc. these guys do move a lot. I once followed a mountain lion from the Black Hills of South Dakota. I did it indirectly, where people had collected scats and done DNA analysis. But from the Black Hills of South Dakota to the edge of a interstate highway in Connecticut, 30 miles from New York City,
Wow.
where it got hit by a car. Animals can move.
Yeah.
And they're always probing, and that's part of the value. It's like white-tailed deer, right? They produce a lot of young, and those young have to disperse to find habitat in the stages that they like, the early stages of forest succession, with a lot of brush and, varied grasslands and, a variety of plants that you don't get in a closed forest, as you know.
Yep.
So, they're dispersing all the time. So if they're contained, or they've got essentially a fence in the form of new housing, new agricultural lands, or whatever that they're not allowed on, how do they do that? And so if you're in Africa and you're looking at the elephants in Manyara, they've got to get to Ruaha. They have to get from Ruaha up to the Serengeti. They have to, there's a string of wonderful wildlife parks there, but they are all islands. And so what they're doing now is going in between those reserves, working with communities and who have problems with wildlife coming through. Sometimes the elephants are eating crops, or the lions are considered dangerous, or taking livestock. Coming up with, a whole lot of creative plans that end up making that passageway between the existing reserves permeable to wildlife. You don't have to go and create another park. You don't have to make a super park over the whole area. You have to make corridors or wildways or habitat bridges or whatever you want to call them that allow animals to move and adapt and reproduce. And that is being undertaken in parts of Africa, in parts of Asia. Thailand has some reserves bordering Myanmar, the old Burma, I guess. And here in the U.S., we've got some landscape level plans taking shape in a number of areas, but actually in reasonable shape in the what is called the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which is 2,000 miles from south of Yellowstone up to well north into the Yukon. And that, they say, is the size and scale of land that nature needs to, and wildlife populations need to sustain themselves over time. So, and one thing I'll add, can I ramble on a minute? 1 second.
Yeah, please do.
Oh, okay. Part of this is because we've got America is graced with a whole lot of public land. That alone distinguishes us from so many countries, and is part of the reason you and I have been pointing out that things are looking pretty good here compared to much of the world. But what we're finding now, as things get busier, highways get busier, communities grow, there's more logging and mining and, road access into the former backcountry. Our parks in the Rockies are turning into, let's call them near islands. But there's a lot of land in between, public land, that can be managed more in favor of wildlife, less in favor of just cut and run, extraction, or dig and run. And then there's a final key element, and that is private land in the areas between wildlife strongholds. If a bear wants to get from Yellowstone Park to Glacier Park, and the Yellowstone population is isolated, or the elk migrate, or as you say, the pronghorns need to get down into Wyoming, the say Teton National Park into the Red Desert.
Yep.
It's 100 miles. You're going through private lands and fences. So you can change the fencing arrangements. You can put overpasses or underpasses where they have to cross a freeway and occasionally get slaughtered. Many die during storms when they come up against fences they can't cross. And then there's still just the land itself. And if a landowner is operating in a certain way, it's of no use to those animals. If the landowner is willing to keep some of the habitat intact and some of the cover that deer and elk need, for example, in just again a corridor, a right of way for the four-legged critters, that makes all the difference in the world long term. And so the factor I'm trying to point out is land trusts, by which groups go out and arrange conservation easements with private landowners. And these are willing landowners. Nobody's regulating anything. Nobody's forcing anything. It's a win-win deal where they get paid to maintain their land in a wildlife-friendly manner. And maybe you've discussed this on previous podcasts. I probably have. But this has proven to be a key. And Montana's a leader in this, this strategy for keeping wildlife able to move and adapt, and being done with Joe Blow next door. The neighbors, the people in the community who want to see that wildlife and have it in their lives, and it adds up to a lot of acreage in the right places. And because all this has been pretty well mapped out over time by biologists and ecologists, where you can look at a map of a region and say, okay, if I were an elk or a white-tailed deer or a lynx, where would I go? Where would I need to go? And if you're looking at public land management, some pressure from the public to maybe manage it more in favor of wildlife, and then you're looking at private landowners who willingly will take part in this movement pattern, making a movement pattern available, we can make great strides, and we can conserve big nature. And that's what a full wildlife community needs.
Yeah. So if advocating for these kinds of things, such as migration corridors, wildlife passages across highways, helping fund different easement programs, on the migration corridor thing, we have had some good news on that recently. I think there was something like $350 million for migration corridor related work in the recent IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and there was a whole lot of dollars in the infrastructure bill from 2 years ago. So I think there's some steam building there.
There really is. Yeah.
So that's exciting. But I guess, Doug, if you were to have one of my audience members sitting in front of you, and the two of you were drinking a cup of coffee right now, and they've just heard everything you had to say, and I think anyone listening to this podcast is already someone who, has some kind of connection with nature. They're a hunter and an angler. They appreciate these things, but maybe they haven't zoomed out quite as much as we have today and looked at the larger picture or looked outside of their favorite species. And maybe they're hearing this and recognizing, man, I do need to try to do something more than I'm already doing. And you were sitting there across from them. What would be two things that you would tell them now that you would encourage them to do, two actions they could take that you think could make a difference in some kind of
way? Okay. I would first, depending on who I'm talking to, but settle them down and say, I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm making it up as I go along. And by the way, you don't have to take off your camo and start wearing hemp clothing, or any, hunters like to, there's this weird distinction in our culture where people say I'm a conservationist, but I'm no environmentalist, because environmentalism means marching on nuclear power plants or whatever is going on, and or a big fight over a polluting plant or something, and a lot of people just don't see themselves in that role, and I don't see it in my role. So I would say right now, maybe the most effective thing hunters can do is talk to each other and come up with their own solution rather than listen to this guy you're talking to right now, and just say, well, look, I know we love hunting together, and we've spent a lot of time outdoors together, and by the way, I've noticed you're kind of you like to track the other carnivores out there, or you like to spend time, I don't know, just seeing what else is there. I mean, that's part of the joy of being out on a day in the woods, and there is a problem and what can we do just to make life a little easier for the critters here, and make sure they're still around for the next generation. And gosh, I don't know. What do you think? I mean, I don't see myself as a letter writer, but I might be able to get down to that city hall meeting about the development going in that area we like to hunt near, or that maybe that area we like to hunt in, and put in our 2 cents worth, and learn a bit more about it, and go in and say, well, here's what the deer need, here's what the whatever your favorite critter is, or plant, and start at that level rather than me throw out, you should join this group or that group. I would recommend looking into land trusts. They always need, a few extra bucks and maybe some time from people. And I'm sure some of your listeners are already active volunteers in going out and restoring some landscapes, rehabbing trout streams, or, their favorite fishing spot. I don't know how many would be looking at the endangered mussels that probably live in that water and filter it and help make it clear and keep pollutants down. But that'd be worth getting to know more about. I'd start small, and I'd start with like-minded people and try to figure out together what difference one person can make. And this is a big global problem. We've got a head start on some of the solutions here in the U.S. How can we make them happen sooner and better?
Yeah, I think that's
a pretty vague answer. I'm sorry if that,
but great advice. I think that there's I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who said something like he appreciates the man that takes the first step more than he appreciates the man that strategizes about the 200 steps to come. There's something to be said about just doing what you can right now, like doing that one little thing, starting small, but doing something. And it's so easy to want to just sit around and think, well, geez, this is so much bigger than me. I don't know what to do. Or you could do this, you could do this, you could do this, and then never actually take any action. I was just yesterday, this morning, I emailed you and told you I was running late because my flight got delayed. Yeah. I was in Massachusetts yesterday at a volunteer habitat day on a wildlife management area just outside of Boston. And we had almost 100 folks come out to clean up, pick up trash, pick up shotgun shells, take all sorts of stuff out of there, put up wood duck boxes, put up bluebird boxes. It was nothing fancy. We weren't doing anything profound. We weren't solving all the world's problems, but there was dozens and dozens of people out there together in a community, hunters and anglers, people who care about wildlife and wild places, and they were making a difference that day in a small way, but in a tangible way. And I felt this like energy when we were talking, in different small groups. People could feel the the positive impact of, in one small way today, putting a dent in this thing. And I think that I'm curious if you think there's truth to this or not, Doug, but I think there's power in momentum. And if you can take that little step today, and I think it helps form an identity if you act in some way. So yesterday I picked up trash all day with a bunch of folks who care about wildlife, and that seeps into my pores. And now tomorrow I feel more and more like, I'm someone who works for wildlife, who cares about these things. And so when I get that email from some conservation organization saying, hey, you know what, we need people to call their senators because there's this thing coming down the pipeline. Well, now, you know what? Hey, I just did this thing last weekend. I can do this thing now tomorrow. And then after that, the next thing comes up, and all of a sudden, 2 months from now, I'm planting trees or whatever it is. I think these things can snowball, and there's momentum that builds with every tiny little step. And eventually, all of that adds up. And I think if more and more people start taking these little push the snowball down the hill kind of actions, all of a sudden we've got an avalanche and we can tackle this thing. Is that crazy?
Yes. No. Of course, look, you already are doing a lot yourself and at a lot of levels. And I certainly thank you for that. And on behalf of a lot of overlooked critters, but, and you can tell I'm really reluctant to offer advice, and yet that's what people need. And I think you put it splendidly. And I just feel really good about that sort of thing. And it's not because I feel righteous or oh boy, am I a good citizen here. It's just planting trees is a joy in itself, and pulling out weeds is the same way. It's weird, but it works for some of us. And if that leads to, meeting other people and sharing ideas and seeing what you have in common and then taking some next steps, that's just about perfect. I mean, I when you asked for recommendations and you talked about Teddy Roosevelt, I'd say, well, I did forget to recommend that somebody out there just needs to run for president and turn into the next Teddy Roosevelt. But
yeah.
One of your listeners, come on, guys, gals.
Yes, someone's got to step up. We do need that. Well, Doug, this has been just the conversation I've been needing and been wanting to have. So thank you for chatting with me about all of this. I 100% would recommend anyone listening to pick up your book, 4/5 of Grizzly. It's great. It takes everything we talked about here today and expands on it in a lot of different ways. And it's a beautiful book, amazing photos. I couldn't recommend it enough. But what I would like you to do, if you don't mind, is there any other one of your books, if you had to recommend one other of your many, many publications and things out there that you think our audience might be interested in, or that you're particularly proud of, that maybe is collecting dust in the archives that you published long ago, since you've been at this a while? Is there any other piece of work that you'd like to send folks to check out other than this one that I will shout from the mountaintops for you?
Well, yeah, I'm strictly unbiased here. No, I would recommend The Wolverine Way, which was published by Patagonia before 4/5 of Grizzly. And the reason I'm bringing that out is in the course of learning about wolverines, and again, starting almost from scratch, nobody knew much about them at all, and the work we did, and I did just as a happy volunteer, staying for weeks at a time out in remote outposts and catching wolverines and get radios on them. They move like nobody else. They social systems all different. It was just every day brought new discoveries, and that is a reward unto itself. And it also brings out the fact that, look, I love to hunt. I love to, stalk animals, get close enough to watch them. And, I'm not so much into taking something home with me. But man, when I'm doing that, all my senses are firing. I'm the human of the day, but I'm also the human that arose, from our ancestors with all my nerves and hormones and senses going at, like they're built to be. And I know that's a good why guys like hunting, and I like hunting too. I come at it in a different way, but I'm not going to say I totally get it, but I certainly get that. And I got it with tracking wolverines and learning about them. And on a typical day, I'd be following their tracks past bighorn sheep and mountain goats and moose and crossing lion tracks, wolf tracks, coyotes that follow the wolverines to scavenge the carcasses they leave, snowshoe hares that the coyote veered off on to go hunt. It just brought the whole community fully to life. And I think it gets at the dedication of some of the researchers out there, but mostly at the joy of learning about new species and how they live. And it's a good adventure story too. A lot of mountaineering and pretty tough animal to work with, and pretty fierce, but nothing like its reputation for being a danger to people in the woods. But wow. Anyway, that would be the one.
Perfect.
Because it's the closest I've written to a hunting book.
That does.
Nothing else.
That does sound like a good read. That's one I haven't read yet, so it'll be on my list. The only thing I have against wolverines is that I went to Michigan State University, and our arch rivals are the University of Michigan Wolverines. So I will try not to hold that against your book, and I'll give it a read.
I appreciate that, well, but the other thing I wanted to, this isn't shooting my own horn here. It's just that's why I do what I do. I didn't plan, at first I just wanted to go out and learn about wolverines, and I liked hanging out with the guys. They're all good woodsmen and, skiers and comfortable out in the remote areas. But partway through, I realized, God, we just need to know so much more about them. We need to manage them differently. And it's made a difference. The wildlife management agencies are paying much more attention now to wolverines than they did in the past, and the wolverines seem to be doing a bit better. And they're expanding their range over in Washington State and down into Oregon, it looks like. So that is really rewarding. That comes back to, whether it's picking up trash, or if you're a writer like me, you point and wave and try to spur smarter people or more capable people to take the next step. Yeah. So anyway, thanks for asking that. And thanks for all the time. This has been great. I really enjoyed it.
Me too, Doug. I hope we can chat again soon. And I know that our listeners will be looking forward to the next book from you whenever that comes down the line too. So we'll be waiting on pins and needles. Get to work, Doug.
Thanks for another job, Mark. Okay, I'll get on it. Thanks again.
And that is a wrap. Thank you for tuning in. I can't recommend Doug's book enough. Pick up 4/5 a Grizzly. I highly, highly recommend it. And it sounds like the Wolverine Way is certainly worth our time too. And all that said, tune back in next week. We're diving in deep to a specific piece of conservation legislation that can make a big difference this year and next year and in the future. And we can help make that come to fruition. So until then, thanks for being here. Keep on doing good work out there for wild places and wildlife. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.
Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the engineer's going to be there. Meat Eater Live, headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay, every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Art Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.